Good evening, everybody. Well, thanks to everyone for coming out, especially in this age when we're all sort of rationing out our in-person interaction. So thanks to people who are here, and thanks to the panelists for coming in today. So good evening. My name is Craig Sutton, and I'm an associate professor of mathematics, the director of the EE Just program, and also the House Professor of Schoolhouse. And on behalf of the Schoolhouse community, I want to welcome everybody to the Schoolhouse Anti-Racism Experience, or SHARE. For a little background, I guess in the wake of the killings of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd, murders that horrified a nation and raised the possibility of a national reckoning with systemic and structural racism, students, faculty, and staff in Schoolhouse came together to discuss how we could have an impact. Many of us had previously lived through moments of national outrage over racial injustice. However, those moments of national outrage were seemingly fleeting. It did not bring about the fundamental change they demanded. So we resolved to do our best to ensure that this time would be different at Dartmouth and nationwide. As bringing about fundamental change is an all-hands-on-deck endeavor, the intergenerational and interdisciplinary nature of Schoolhouse and the houses more generally seem like an ideal vehicle for nurturing difficult conversations and sustaining our campus efforts to create an anti-racist campus and America. From this, the Schoolhouse Anti-Racism Coalition, or SHARC, was born, an organization open to any member of the Dartmouth community who was genuinely interested in advancing this cause. After months of planning, SHARC is pleased to welcome you to the kickoff of the Schoolhouse Anti-Racism Experience, a series of anti-racist events inspired by the groundbreaking and Emmy-Award-winning HBO miniseries Watchmen. Set in 2019 and based on the 1986 DC comic of the same name, HBO Watchmen reimagines and remixes the Watchmen universe through an origin story rooted in the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. This timely and prescient series, which tackles race and structural racism head-on, creatively opens portals to issues related to anti-Black racism, white nationalism and white supremacy, memory and intergenerational trauma, policing and police violence, and social and economic justice. It is SHARC's hope that by using Watchmen as our common departure point, we'll bring more people into the conversation, ultimately creating an even larger coalition of students, faculty, and staff committed to creating an anti-racist reality. Today, we are pleased to be joined by Jovan Lewis from UC Berkeley and Karla Slocum from UNC Chapel Hill, who will use the Tulsa Race Massacre as a departure point for a conversation that will touch on themes of freedom and Black placemaking, violence and dispossession, and reparations and Black futures. This conversation will be moderated by Darius Scott. Darius Scott has joined the Dartmouth College faculty as an assistant professor of geography in 2020. Prior to arriving in Hanover, Dr. Scott graduated with honors from Morehouse College with a degree in English. In 2018, he earned a doctorate in geography from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he subsequently worked as a postdoctoral research fellow in the School of Medicine. Dr. Scott's research explores the stories people tell about the places they live, move through, and seek to dismantle. This is done through an examination of oral histories and personal narratives which foreground localized Black senses of place, distorting milieus of anti-Black violence and sexual stigma. Ultimately, his work engages ongoing discussions in Black studies, queer studies, public health, and Black geographies. Let's welcome Darius Scott.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm so excited to introduce the two speakers today and to have a good discussion. So Jovan Scott Lewis is an associate professor of geography at the University of California, Berkeley. At Berkeley, Jovan founded the Black Geographies Project and currently co-leads the Economic Disparities Research Cluster in the university's Othering and Belonging Institute. Jovan's research is concerned with articulations of racialized poverty, which he examines through questions of racial capitalism, underdevelopment, and radical terms of repair. His work in Jamaica resulted in a monograph called Scammer's Yard, The Crime of Black Repair in Jamaica. He is currently at work on a second book, which traces the consequences of the 1921 race massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Karla Slocum is a professor of anthropology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. At the university, she is also director of the Institute for African American Research, Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the Thomas Willis Lambeth Distinguished Chair in Public Policy. Her research focuses on communities known as Black towns or U.S. settlements dating back to the late 19th century that were established to provide freedom and security to people of African descent. Her important publications include the book manuscript, Black Towns, Black Futures, The Enduring Allure of a Black Place in the American West. She is also a co-creator of the Tulsa Syllabus, a resource guide that centers sources on the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, as well as related themes such as racial terror, Black placemaking in Oklahoma, and the United States. Dr. Slocum has been awarded grants and fellowships from the National Science Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, and the School for Advanced Research. Please join me in welcoming Drs. Karla Slocum and Jovan Scott Lewis. Okay, so as someone who studies race and placemaking in the US, I'm excited to learn ways that Tulsa is a unique story and ways in which it offers a familiar one. Starting off, could you both talk to the matters of freedom and Black placemaking in Tulsa?
Can you say that again? Can we talk to the
matters of freedom
matters?
and Black placemaking in Tulsa.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm really glad to be here and excited to have this conversation tonight. You know, regarding freedom and Black placemaking, so I do research on Black towns in Oklahoma, which are rural places in the American West. And I think one thing that we have to think about is that Black placemaking actually is nationwide in the United States. So I think that really is something that we have to keep in mind, and that we have examples across the country, including the American West, which is the story that I'm most interested in which Black people have sought to create communities and spaces where they can try to achieve freedom. And we see that historically, and we see that even contemporarily, actually. So it's not something that we just want to think about as the past is sort of just a post-emancipation type of phenomenon. It actually exists more broadly across time. I could say more, but I'll let Jovan jump in, and then maybe we can sort of dialogue about that.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, the question of freedom and Black placemaking is, you know, a question about emancipation. And, you know, not only what does freedom, you know, feel like, but where is freedom? And I think, you know, the idea of the relationship between freedom and place is, you know, a really contentious question, because for African Americans in the West, right, or sort of Africans who were brought into the West and who became African Americans, you know, non-freedom was a place, right? And so the tension has always been how to, I think, find liberty, find freedom, and be at home in that place of freedom. And so what we see is, you know, from, you know, efforts of, you know, marronage, right, runaway slaves, right, from speaking specifically in the United States, you know, post-emancipation migration, meaning immediately after emancipation, you know, immediately following the failure of Reconstruction, the various great migrations that we all, you know, read about in, you know, in high school, you know, to this very day, where there is the need for upward mobility that is often framed as moving out of one's community to another community, i.e. the suburbs. What you can see is that the African-American notion of freedom cannot be untethered from a question of geography, right? It's always a seeking of an elsewhere. And that's the problem, right? Because, you know, to be truly free is to be at home where you are. And so I think that's the kind of departure point for the conversation. And why, you know, Karla looking to the West, right, is actually, you know, the kind of cardinal movement for figuring out where freedom is. And that's been the constant, I think, impulse of African-American becoming and belonging is, you know, the biblical vine and fig tree, right? And I think that's where, you know, you can't disaggregate the question of freedom from geography, right? It is not just about being free in terms of one's person, right, i.e. citizenship. It is about being able to exercise that citizenship in creating a relationship to geography. And that, I think, is the foundational dilemma that African-American communities continue to face.
Okay. I know we want to be careful to not historicize Black Tulsa. And with that in mind, I'm wondering if we can look at history for a moment and talk about the kind of beginnings, if there is such a thing, of Blackness in Tulsa, of people, seeking freedom there and, doing these placemaking things.
Yeah, well, for me, one of the most important things to think about is that Tulsa emerges as a place with a Black presence eventually out of what used to be called Indian Territory. So Oklahoma, before it became the state of Oklahoma, was an area of the country known as Indian Territory. And so really Tulsa, and this is true of almost all, not all, Black towns in Oklahoma, Black communities in Oklahoma, that they are, the complexities of this whole idea of seeking freedom through place is that sometimes that freedom that you're seeking attached to a particular place is actually a place that belongs to somebody else, right? And so that is the history of Oklahoma, that is the history of Tulsa. So the Black presence, the creation of the areas in Tulsa that we're thinking about as Black Tulsa, some of you have heard it called Greenwood, also known as North Tulsa, that area of Tulsa where Black communities were concentrated. Really, we have to understand the Native American history to that place, and that's where we get into this question of land dispossession. So that's kind of the origin. I think we have to acknowledge those origins of Tulsa. I forgot the rest of your question, but I just wanted to kind of underscore that point.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really, just wondering about the history of Black placemaking there in Tulsa, which I think you did answer for us. I'm wondering if Jovan has something to add.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you should tell them a little bit more about the history of Blacktown Formation in Indian Territory. Yeah, generally. Okay. So, I mean, so thinking about, post-1889, land rush.
Yes, and so we have to think about that the part of Blacktown making and so one thing to think about, I don't know how well the audience is familiar with what we're referring again to as Black Tulsa, but we really have to think about the fact that there were a lot of Black communities that were formed historically, starting in the 19th century especially, across this western region. And that part of that process of those town formations, whether they were in an urban area like Tulsa or whether they were in a rural area, and there were many more in rural areas than urban areas, there were two processes by which that happened. One was the land rush, and we don't tend to think, we weren't taught in high school history, and maybe even college history sometimes, that Black people participated in the land rush. Okay, so there was that. But then there were also the parceling up of Native American lands in Indian Territory through something known as the Dawes Act, which was a congressional act, was the forcible taking of land from Native American tribes, the lands that they owned communally, breaking them up into individual parcels. And through those individual parcels, then there was land that people saw as becoming available that some Black people actually, took up residence in. I'm blanking on another way to say that. So I think we just have to understand that part of the town formation and the community formation in that era, in the late 19th century, going into the early 20th century.
Yeah, I mean, because that background is important, because Tulsa, right, or not Tulsa proper, I mean, Tulsa does get formed as based upon the possession of Creek land. However, Greenwood, right, where we're thinking specifically about Black Tulsa, is purchased, land from Creek freedmen. And, so we have, we have about 1905, 1906, you have a couple of early, entrepreneurs who show up to Tulsa, effectively reproducing this ongoing model of Blacktown Formation, where, African Americans, sometimes in partnership with whites, get access to capital, purchase land, and form a community, right? And Karla could tell us a lot more about the intricacies of that process, but so this is the foundation, at least in my view, of how I like to think about Greenwood, is that Greenwood, while a district, right? Greenwood, while a section of an already established city, the city that was trying to grow, especially after the discovery of oil, right? In 1903, 1905, the idea is that the process of Greenwood's formation was very similar to that of the founding of some of the all-black towns throughout Indian Territory. And to my mind, it's important to think about that because we hear about the legacy of Greenwood, Black Wall Street, right, Negro Wall Street. And it's important to note that in many ways, Greenwood wasn't exceptional in this kind of longer history of black town or black area formation in Indian Territory. So I think, that is an important part in terms of thinking about the history of Greenwood. There was an advantage, I think, making the distinction between a rural and, whatever we can call, I guess we can call Tulsa somewhat urban at that point, is that it was proximate to industry, and not that African Americans were necessarily directly permitted to participate in the economy, say, of the oil industry. But there were secondary and tertiary economic opportunities that came from being so close to the oil industry in Tulsa. But with that being said, it's important to really, really kind of contemplate on the fact that Tulsa wasn't, Greenwood wasn't necessarily innovative in the way that its geography, its township, as it were, was formed. In many ways, there were other, black towns that were much more successful in terms of building out whole apparatuses of governance and commercial complexity. But I think that's an important, point in terms of the history. The second point is that Greenwood is founded, basically just several months to a year before Oklahoma statehood. And that is, Oklahoma becomes a state in 1907. Greenwood is founded roughly around 1906. And that's the difference, right? Is that almost as soon as Greenwood is founded, Indian Territory joins with Oklahoma Territory, becomes the state of Oklahoma. And so there are these consequences of the kind of formal arrival of Jim Crow to the state. And so that is where Greenwood, in many ways, departs from the history of these other all-black towns, is that the broader political circumstances, are much different at this early stage of the district's formation.
There's something I want to add to your first point also, which is just sort of for our general consideration, which is that, so most of you, if you think about Oklahoma, you probably think of a very white state, right? You might think about Native American presence in Oklahoma. You're unlikely to think about black people in Oklahoma. And I tell this story in my book about how when I first started my research, some of my black friends and colleagues who are academics kind of wondered if I was going to be okay going to Oklahoma as a black person. They thought it might be a place that would be inhospitable to me because they were imagining that there were no other black people there. And so I think we should all digest this information from your first point, which is that you can think about the state of Oklahoma as having been, like, the whole landscape of the state is full of black communities. I mean, there are the number keeps rising ever since I started doing my research. When I first started my research in the early 2000s, the idea was that there were, I think it was 32 or 36 historic black towns in Oklahoma. And the numbers, they just keep adding to the numbers because the historical record is showing us even more. And so the latest number I saw was something like 62. So if you think about the fact that there's this kind of, the landscape has that kind of a black presence, I think that's really important to think about. And then to go back to the Tulsa point is, for our consciousness right now, the fact that we've seen Watchmen, that's been a very popular show, of course, and then also the recent centenary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. So we've heard much more about Tulsa than we have. And I would imagine that most of us think that Tulsa is the example and the place of a Black experience in Oklahoma. And so I just really want us to sort of digest that fact that we have to think much more broadly about Oklahoma, and then thinking about that as in its western location too, and Blackness having a strong presence there.
That's right. I mean, and so we have to think about Oklahoma like the work of Ed McCabe, right, who tried to create, one of the first instances of creating an all-Black state, or at least a program for creating an all-Black state, took place in Oklahoma. I mean, I think, Oklahoma had one of the largest numbers of Universal Negro Improvement Association chapters in the country, right? After, Marcus Garvey founded the UNIA in 1914 in New York City. So, I mean, there's always been a very serious Black presence and a very serious and very, when I say serious, I mean really serious commitment to a kind of Black political existence in Oklahoma. And I think it's right that, a lot of that did not take place in Tulsa, right? In between the all-Black towns and, say, the forming of the UNIA chapters in Oklahoma, there was a serious commitment to emancipationism in the state, right? So, so Black Oklahomans who were thinking about, either repatriating to Africa or creating, becoming a part of a Black nation elsewhere in the world. So I think, it's important to note that in many ways, Oklahoma is perhaps one of the Blackest states in terms of, like, historically, in terms of a political commitment that we probably have.
It's so interesting. I'm wondering, I'm hearing, Oklahoma be described as a place where, there's this history of Native dispossession, right? And then we're hearing it's a story or a place where there is a search for Black freedom and emancipation, uniquely so perhaps. And I'm wondering, can we talk about historically, folks are showing up to Greenwood, for instance, in Tulsa and building, what's called Black Wall Street. What's working against them? What is that experience like? We know there are challenges to that all over the U.S., right? And so I'm wondering if you could talk perhaps specifically about what's going on there in Tulsa, then and now.
I'll let you start. Yeah.
So in terms of what, like the creation of Black Wall Street, I mean.
The creation of Black Wall Street, right? Because, and I know we'll talk about the massacre later, but
You're right.
Tulsa is, for better or worse, a notable site of anti-Black violence. And I'm imagining, we can't say that's happening, randomly, right? It relates to some larger thread of what's going on there. So I'm wondering if you could talk to that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think because we think about the 1921 Race Massacre, and we tend to think that kind of thing has to take place in a place that is overtly and regularly anti-Black, right? And Jim Crow is anti-Blackness, right? And so we have to think about that in the generalized context of Jim Crow segregation. But there wasn't really up until the massacre in 1921, there wasn't really a regular accounting of lynchings of Black people, in Tulsa, right? I mean, whites were perhaps more likely to be lynched in Tulsa, right? I mean, the concern, just to hop into the discussion around the race massacre, but the concern around the possible mob violence around Dick Rowland, the guy who was charged with assaulting Sarah Page, that ended up being the thing that instigated the white mob to go do its thing, was because the year before a white man, Roy Belton, had been lynched, right? And so it's a complicated history, that, because again, Greenwood being Black Wall Street, well, what does that mean, right? It meant that it was a commercial district, and not necessarily different from a lot of the other Black commercial districts that we know across the country. Durham in North Carolina had perhaps as robust a Black commercial district. But what was unique, I think, about Greenwood was that it's Black elite, right? There were interracial business partnerships. There were these really complicated relationships that capitalism made possible, right? That kind of extended past the kind of, the apparent strict, delineations that were Jim Crow. And so, if anything, what I would say is that there was an intimacy, an interracial intimacy that was present in Tulsa, that allowed for, these kinds of moments of violence to flare up, right? Meaning you have to be close enough to somebody, right, to, somehow hurt them or to, somehow have a claim made against you. Not always, right? We know that, but the point is that I want us to kind of think a bit more broadly about what the underground kind of sense of place was in Tulsa around that time. The other thing is that there was a class hierarchy within Greenwood, right? A fair majority of Greenwood's black residents were really poor, right? And so we tend to think about Greenwood Avenue, right? Black Wall Street, as representative of the entirety of Greenwood, the community. And that's also somewhat, misplaced, right? There was we have a concentric circle of impoverishment. The further out you were, the poorer you were, right? And so, I say that, not to undermine the narrative, but to actually make, what that district accomplished even more impressive, right? Because why were there poor people in Greenwood? Because there was, relative success, relative opportunity. And like in any other context, poor people migrate to a place where there's opportunity. And so a lot of the poor blacks in Greenwood had arrived, right? They continue to migrate from places like Alabama and so forth over the decades, looking for opportunity. But what that meant was that actually it was in spite of Jim Crow, in spite of segregation, in spite of these limitations on social and economic life, it was actually quite a complex, local society, right? Where, records will show that there were, white citizens of Tulsa, right, who held debt, right? Who were indebted to, black capitalists, right, from Greenwood. So I think, just to kind of put that as a kind of foundational, like, contextualization for what we're thinking about in terms of, kind of anti-black racism. Because in a way, it wasn't any more exceptional than any other kind of anti-black racism in the Jim Crow period, anywhere else, right? In fact, the capital and, land ownership, relative land ownership, made it a slightly more opportune place, right? The idea that, a dollar in Greenwood, right, a black dollar in Greenwood could circulate 18 times, right? When I was doing research, I was talking to an elder there, and he was like, you could write your name on a dollar bill, and you'll see it before the day is done, right? I mean, that tells you something, right? That tells you something about the way that commerce worked, the ways that, the economy functioned, and it didn't function explicitly in a vacuum, right? And so what that meant was that there were these relationships that I think trouble, a very clear and neat narrative of anti-black racism in Tulsa at the time. Of course, the Race Massacre is, an exceptional, occasion, and it is worthy of examination as an incident and as a part of a broader structure of anti-black racism, not discounting that whatsoever. But I think in thinking about the generalized environment, we have to think about it as a complex way, because in fact, most of the Jim Crow South was complex in this way. In fact, we can go back to accounts of life on the plantation, right, during the period of slavery. And, Julius Scott in The Common Wind talks about the porosity of the plantation, right? It wasn't necessarily what we think of as this overtly carceral space, right? And so it's important for us to think about this porosity, these openings, because what they do, like the general story of Tulsa, is they let us see glimpses of black autonomy, right? Of black livingness, as the term is kind of said now. And so I think that's a necessary component of thinking about what we think of when we think about anti-blackness, anti-black racism in Tulsa around this period.
I'm wondering in what ways that, kind of unique racial history of Tulsa, makes the massacre itself perhaps more of something we need to be questioning, that it did happen there, where there were these intimate relations between, black bankers and white folks. And so how can we start to make sense of that, maybe?
So are you asking, how do we make sense of the kinds of relationships that were there that?
I suppose I'm asking about the event itself, the 1921 massacre. What's going on to, accommodate, such violence, given the complicated history, given the intimate ties and the relationships that have been formed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so let's think of it this way, right? There is a black shoe shine named Dick Rowland, right, who doesn't have restroom facilities at his immediate place of employment. So to use a restroom, he goes to a segregated restroom in a white building. He enters into an elevator with a white female elevator operator. So that's a perfect example of the intimacies that I'm talking about, right? So if we're thinking about Jim Crow as being truly binaristic, right? Meaning like hard line segregation, right? Then even that shouldn't really be possible. But we know that that's not, in fact, how, Jim Crow societies work. Black people and white people, pass by each other all of the time, right? There were different levels of engagement. We know that from, time immemorial on the plantation landscape, there were intimacies between black help and white employers, right? We know that these kinds of things existed. So again, it's a question of the proximity, right? So Dick Rowland, goes into the Drexel building, and apparently, we don't really know the proper story. He steps on the foot of, or brushes his elbow against, or does something to startle the white elevator operator, Sarah Page. Right, a clerk in the store overhears Page being startled, and Rowland runs, and the clerk tells the police that Rowland assaulted Page. Right? The next day, Rowland is arrested. He's taken to the sheriff's office, the police station, and whispers in the community begin. Right? Oh, black guy assaulted this white woman, and it's an opportunity. Right? Again, I mentioned earlier that the year before, right, a white man, Roy Belton, was lynched, for committing an actual crime. He murdered a taxi driver or something like that. But, there was this vigilante justice that was very much a part, I think, of the I wouldn't call it the culture, anthro professors here would, but still, right, it was a practice, right? We know, IDB Wells tells us about, documents very, very, very closely the kind of rise of lynch mob vigilantism, right, in the United States, right, especially after 1915. So, what you have is an opportunity for this form of expression of violence, right? And it emerges out of, these opportunities for interracial intimacy. Right? It is ready, it is convenient, right? It is useful. And what you see is in many ways an attempt to solve, I think, a broader problem, right? Which is actually this issue of black presence in a white space, right? But I don't know, I don't know exactly, because I'm thinking about your last question. Because your last question was a two-part, like how we think about Black Wall Street then and anti-blackness, how do we think about it now, right? And I'm connecting back to that last question because in many ways, at least in my work, I argue that what the white mob attempted to accomplish in 1921, right, which was a form of black dispossession, right, the burning down of neighborhoods, the assaulting and the driving away of its citizens effectively happened in the end, right? Where you see now in Greenwood, the development of a whole host of condominiums, right? You see, what we can think of as gentrification of a type, right? You see that happening, several decades before, the 1950s, 1960s with urban renewal, the development of the Interstate Highway 244 that cut through Greenwood. And so the point is that you see this kind of violence, right? The violence that feels, visceral with people murdering people, show up in much more seemingly pedestrian ways, right? Like the creation of a highway, right? Or the development of a condominium. You know, it accomplishes the same, you know, outcome, right? Which is a removal of black people, right? And a, you know, destabilizing of a community. And so I think what's most important is to think about the violence and the possibility of violence in the kind of mob vigilantism that occurred in 1921 as a kind of foundational form of, you know, of geographic violence, right? Which is this violence through dispossession.
I think also, you know, listening to your comments there, I think also we want to think about that what happened in Tulsa is not an exception, right? I think we want to be careful about thinking about this as a case of exceptionalism. And what we do know also is that lynching was already going on in Oklahoma before this happened. And there are some of the most horrific, there's this famous lynching case that took place in Oklahoma that, you know, sort of is nationally known. It's the one where the mother and the son were hanged from a bridge together. So that's one of the most, there was this traveling lynching exhibit that went around a few years ago, and this was one of the prominent cases that is profiled in that account. And that was outside of a black town in Oklahoma. And so this was the landscape. I feel like this was part of what was going on in other places too. Now, what we have in the case of Tulsa is, you know, the attempt to level an entire community. So there is a sort of place dimension to it. At the same time, this kind of lynch mob violence is going on across the South, of course, and it's also going on into the West. And so really, I think it's important to kind of contextualize this violence, this case of violence in in Tulsa, in a broader context. I think it's important to put it into a broader context, lest we think about this as some sort of unique, really horrific case. It's one of many.
Thank you all. Thank you both for those responses. It's really insightful. I'm wondering if we can get back to that placemaking and freedom, so as not to center, you know, anti-black violence, right? As we're talking about a place with such a rich history of black placemaking. I'm wondering if perhaps you can give us more context for thinking about, you know, Oklahoma again as a place where there are black towns coming up compared to maybe other states nearby, compared to, you know, maybe the South proper and you know, the North, right?
Yeah. So the black towns I've been talking about in Oklahoma, what we know is that there are probably over 1,000 such black towns across the country. There is sort of a concentration in certain parts of the West, Midwest, and the South, actually, the Southwest and the Deep South. Actually, there's somebody who's doing research on Texas that has 500 such communities. They have a different label, but they fit the same dynamics and formation processes as the ones that are in other places, including Oklahoma. So this, I think, speaks back to the point made earlier, which is that there are just countless cases of black people attaching freedom to place and trying to think about place making and place remaking, really, in a lot of ways. I think it's important to kind of reframe that idea of place making, remaking a place as a black place for an attempt to acquire freedom. So there's just this constant sort of search, and again, we have those examples all over. So Texas, Kansas, we could just list a number of places, and believe it or not, there are some communities here in the Northeast as well. Slightly different kind of history, but definitely we see it across the country.
And can we talk about Tulsa and Oklahoma's black towns today? are what's going on there.
Yeah. So it's very interesting. So Jovan mentioned something about the narrative, and we have had this conversation before. One of the things that I have argued is that we tend to know these places as having had their Black Wall Streets, having had their moments of economic success because they built up businesses, because they had their own banks, they had their own social institutions, and these are really sort of remarkable achievements, especially for the times. And so there is this narrative of success. What I would argue is that part of what's going on today is how people contend with that narrative of success. On the one hand, and we can have a conversation about what we've seen in different places, but on the one hand, I think people are embracing that narrative because they feel a kind of vindication, like, yes, we actually, we're not all just impoverished, crime-ridden Black communities. We actually have a narrative that tells about things that we have done that have been, for lack of another word, positive. So I think there's that level of it. And I also see people connecting with that history in a way as kind of a motivator to sometimes want to think about what can we do with our communities in the 21st century. I would never call it sort of trying to preserve that history or try to remake what they were, but it is sort of a motivator or an inspiration to think about what can we do now. And so there are all kinds of examples of people trying to, because in rural Black communities anyway, a lot of them are impoverished. They're really not that distinct, really rural Black towns. They're not that distinct from a lot of rural America, so that's really important, regardless of race. But at the same time, the history becomes of what they were, and the narrative of success becomes an inspiration for them to think about ways they can galvanize efforts to start new kinds of businesses and start different sorts of activities, promote tourism and these sorts of things. So I see those sorts of things going on. So on the one hand, what you have is places that are economically struggling and fragile for sure, and there are all different kinds of contemporary global economic reasons why that is the case. And at the same time, they're engaging with our current global economy in ways to try to think about how they can gain some new energy. Yeah.
So when I began doing my research in Tulsa in 2014, I went in there as part of a project that was trying to understand the relationship between cooperation and inequality stroke poverty. And so, my familiarity with Black Tulsa was not through this history of Black Wall Street or the 1921 Race Massacre. I became familiar with Tulsa, or North Tulsa specifically, which is, and we can talk about that geographic, development in a moment. But I became familiar with this Black community in Tulsa as another impoverished Black community that, was suffering from a lack of food access, a lack of educational access, a lack of infrastructure access, meaning you couldn't get a bus to work, you couldn't get a bus to the grocery store, which meant that you relied upon whatever was closest to you in terms of shopping, and what that was the Family Dollar, right? And the Quick Trip gas stations. And so, I saw that community struggling with these various, disparities, and I saw the response was not the state coming in, but rather, a host of nonprofits filling in the gap. And so as a person who is from Jamaica and whose primary research for my PhD was on poverty in Jamaica, North Tulsa felt like the Caribbean to me, right? Where in my home community in Jamaica, American dentists will come down annually as part of a dental mission, right? Same thing with doctors and so forth. And so, but I also felt a familiarity in North Tulsa with the Caribbean for another reason that was less clear initially. So they were poor like Jamaica, right? They were being responded to, or their poverty was being responded to in the way that, you know, Caribbean or Jamaican poverty is responded to, right? With, you know, a lack of ability or a lack of initiative on the part of the state, right? Supplemented by NGOs and nonprofits. But the thing that I felt was that there was a particular relationship, a particular orientation that North Tulsans had to their location, to their geography, that felt very different than other African American communities that I lived and grew up in here in the United States. And it was a sense, right? And as I went about doing my research there and developing my relationships with people there, I then discovered, right, for myself, this history that was a history, right, of belonging, of ownership. The only way that I could put it was in Caribbeanist terms, which was, it was a history of sovereignty, right, in this place. That had everything to do with the ways that these black people showed up in this place at some point, right, and created a sense of belonging and being there. And, you know, so in a way, you know, I want that to be the story, right? You know, in my own project, I'm trying to make that the story, and less the Black Wall Streets, right? Because, you know, when we think about Black Wall Street, when we think about Greenwood, right, what we're thinking about is a well-appointed community, right? We're not talking about Wall Street in that way, and so that's always been a misnomer. What we're talking about is a community that had several options of the things that a community should have. Several churches, several banks, several, you know, maybe not several schools, but a couple of schools, right? Several shops, right? A complex society, a complex community, right? And so, you know, in a way, the Black Wall Street thing is kind of a misdirection. What is most valuable, I think, about North Tulsa, and what I'll explain to you is that North Tulsa today, right, so Greenwood, right, Greenwood is, you know, Greenwood sits at the border with downtown Tulsa, right? So Greenwood was literally at the border between the black and then the whites, you know, divided by the railroad, right? What happened is that, you know, the 1921 Race Massacre occurred, right? What we don't talk about is the fact that Greenwood largely redeveloped, rebuilt, you know, without any insurance payments, without any kind of support from the state or city government, right? And so by the late 1920s, Greenwood was in effect, you know, back to business, quite literally. What happened, right? 1930s, we understand with the introduction of the Hope maps, you have redlining, right? You have systematic disinvestment and the curtailing of investment in communities, right? By the 1950s, by the mid to late 1950s, you see the Federal Highway Act, right? So by the 1960s, you have the development of the highway in Tulsa that literally goes through and demolishes much of Greenwood, right? First, of course, it has to be designated as a blighted area. You know, you have that. Then later on, you have, you know, different entities buying up property. Right now, on a majority of historical Greenwood sits the Oklahoma State University Tulsa campus, right? So you have, you know, this dispossession, the result of which was a migration further north, right? And so when you're thinking about North Tulsa, the geography of North Tulsa is technically distinct from the geography of Greenwood proper, right? But the inhabitants of North Tulsa are effectively, whether directly or in spirit, right, the descendants of Greenwood. So, you know, that Greenwood, right, or that North Tulsa, you know, is today and has been for the past, you know, few decades, right? Because you have an unexceptional story, right, that we see all across the black communities of the United States. Redlining, urban renewal, right? These forms of gentrification and development, right? The introduction and the struggle with various, you know, afflictions, right? Crime, drugs, etc. We know that narrative, and in many ways, that is the narrative of, you know, the past, you know, 5 decades, if you will, of Black Tulsa. But there's still this thing. There's still this commitment. There's still this sense of belonging. And a lot of that work gets facilitated through this narrative, right, of Black Wall Street. But in truth, when I at least showed up in Tulsa in 2014, that was still demonstrated without the language or without the explicit narrative of Black Wall Street. There were people who, my sense was that they understood that they had a right to be where they were. They understood that they came out of a community that had done for themselves. And for them, the biggest challenge, at least from my ethnographic observation, was reconciling with their lack of accomplishment in the contemporary period with this history of knowing that they could accomplish it. And that's different than a history of accomplishment. And I'm saying a history of knowing that they can accomplish it, right? And that to them, at least again, to my observation, was the biggest challenge, right? And so what that resulted in was a problem of community, right? And that was the kind of secondhand danger of the circumstance that they faced, right? Is that they found that, or they viewed that there was something wrong with the composition of their community, right? They needed to kind of rethink how to be together. They needed to rethink, right, what it meant to cooperate, to collaborate. And so in my my early years in Tulsa, that was a lot of the rhetoric, right? How do we heal our community? How do we heal the disconnect? Something was wrong with the community. And if they could fix that, meaning if they could get themselves back to the people who they were, who they know they are, then everything else would simply materialize. And I think that's, it's a slight distinction, but that is, to my mind, still a very meaningful distinction between, I think, this, and I don't want to be terribly controversial, but this narrative of Black excellence, right? What I learned from Tulsa was a narrative of Black capability, right? Not needing to necessarily present as excellent, or as exceptional, but knowing that there's a foundation there and needing to try and get back to it.
I want to mention also, these are great points. I think one thing you have to appreciate too is that narrative of Black success associated with place in Oklahoma. This is where you can start to see, for me, a distinction between Tulsa and the rural Black towns. Right. The narrative of success that is attached to Blackness and place in Oklahoma starts much earlier for the rural Black towns than it does for Tulsa. So when you arrive in 2014, Tulsa's history of having a Black Wall Street is not a predominant public narrative yet. Tulsa's history of its massacre in 1921 is also definitely not a public narrative yet. It took a long time for that to become something that we were exposed to. So for Oklahoma, it was in the 90s when tourism started around the Black towns. So you could take bus tours of the Black towns, and they started to be promoted. And you could read about it in the New York Times. It's just really sort of taking off in starting in mid-1990s. I wouldn't say it's quite taking off, but maybe taking off in the early 2000s. And so Tulsa was buried. And so you couldn't go to the the Oklahoma Tourism Department or something and get information about how do I tour this history of Tulsa. That's something that, it's a story that's been buried for so long. Clearly not in the community, which is what you know from your research, but publicly we had not been exposed to it. This is a very, very recent public narrative that we have. The Black towns were promoted because what they don't have is that story of atrocity and anti-Black violence. That they have those stories, first of all, let's be clear. They have those stories, but they don't have the prominent one that has been buried, that Tulsa, that the state has tried to silence for very long. So I think that's a really important one about this narrative of success. You don't find it ubiquitously. You don't find it being ubiquitous at earlier points in time across Blackness and place in Oklahoma. The Tulsa inclusion of that is much more recent.
Fascinating. I'm wondering if you can talk to the idea of reparation and Black futures. And Tulsa, given that since you said you found with a relationship to place and maybe a sense of pride, and also the history of the Black towns there, people going and visiting, what can we think about in terms of reparations and in terms of future movement.
Yeah. Jovan has a lot to say about reparations. I'll let Jovan say some things about reparations. Although, so some of the bus tours that I did ethnographic research on bus tours that go through Oklahoma's black towns. And there's a case to be made that some of the tour operators, sometimes these tours are targeted for black Tulsans actually, and blacks in Oklahoma. So they're seen as, they're led by local organizations to try to expand the knowledge about black history in Oklahoma. And so they take people who are in Oklahoma on these bus tours, and they especially advertise to black communities. And some of those tours actually have some real progressive kinds of narratives about the history, some of them actually controversial narratives. But some of them actually, to me, touch upon making a case about not necessarily reparations, but kind of making a case about the kinds of things that are due to black people in Oklahoma in general. And some of the one of the things I found really fascinating was that some of the narratives about black towns are layered onto the narrative of history. So if you wanted to learn that if you wanted to get public exposure to the narrative about Tulsa, you can go on a rural Blacktown bus tour, because they're going to tell you about Tulsa on that tour. That's a space where you're going to hear that. You're not going to hear it anywhere else, but you're going to hear it in this place. So these are the kinds of the spaces where I felt like I was hearing some of the narrators actually try to weave in some critical commentary about so not formal efforts for reparations, but kind of making some kinds of arguments and cases for the kinds of things that black people had been, black people were due, and things that had been taken away from them. About black futures, this is where I can kind of go towards some of the things Jovan has mentioned about belonging, in the sense that one of the things that for the black towns is they promote themselves through a bunch of cultural festivals and events, and rodeos are big ones. And I argue that these are really important spaces of black affirmation. You're a tiny black town that only is comprised of a few hundred people, and then you have these events that draw in tens of thousands of people, and it's this big black cultural event, and it's very affirming. And I think that for these kinds of events, they signal a kind of interest in black community more generally. And so I just kind of see that sort of that attraction to the place, I think, is part of, I think about that in terms of kind of building Blacktown futures, is continuing these sorts of efforts to demonstrate the attractiveness of the black towns. And I think that is important, because there's this sense of the success was in the past, they don't really have anything to offer right now, and I think these kind of festivals and events kind of negate that narrative of everything was in the past, there's nothing to offer now. It's actually, this is a really great place to commune with other black people and affirm who we are and celebrate one another and that sort of thing. So, yeah.
So there's a history of reparations in Tulsa for the Race Massacre of 1921. So the first proper attempt was in the mid-90s. It culminated in a report, in 2001, that suggested reparations for a variety of reasons. It never worked out. Last year, there was another formal attempt, and so there's a current ongoing reparations case being brought, against the city, and against several defendants. But the issue here is that this contemporary case for reparations is unique because they're using Oklahoma's unique nuisance law, right? And so they're arguing that the 1921 Race Massacre created a nuisance for black people in Tulsa that is ongoing. And so one of the reasons why the previous reparations case failed was that the argument was that it passed the statute of limitations, right? And even though, you know, the attempt to silence the history of the race massacre was, you know, recognized by the courts, you know, the court still argued, well, you know, you had at least from the 1970s to bring this case, because by that point you had access to more information. So anyway, so the current reparations case, you know, kind of, you know, obviates this claim by saying, well, it's an ongoing nuisance, right? And so with the nuisance law in Oklahoma, you know, the statute of limitations, you know, only begins once a nuisance ends, right? And so to argue that the nuisance is ongoing, meaning what? So there was a race massacre, 1921. There was urban renewal. There was the creation of the highway. There was, you know, dispossession, et cetera, et cetera. There's contemporary poverty, right? All of these are looked upon as a kind of successive injuries, right, of the original kind of injury of the 1921 race massacre. So, and interestingly, you know, the team is using the nuisance law because the state of Oklahoma successfully used that law against opioid pharmaceutical companies, right? Or sorry, pharmaceutical companies for the opioid crisis, right? And so, and they won, right? And so, you know, reparations in Tulsa is an actual ongoing project. Now, aside from the legal case, you know, there is an interesting question around reparations in Tulsa because it shifts its emphasis away from what we think of as the kind of generalized claim of reparations in America for African American enslavement, right? The reparations case in Tulsa isn't about slavery, right? What it's about Black Wall Street and its destruction in 1921 and the devastating, you know, consequences of, you know, ongoing, you know, assault against its community since then by the city and the state. So two things, you know, are interesting about that. One, well, the one really interesting thing about that is that, you know, so there are two things that are interesting about it. So on the one hand, you know, to kind of think about reparations out for Black people outside of slavery, right? It actually decenters slavery as the kind of foundational experience of Black formation in this country, right? Meaning to say, post-emancipation, right, post the failure of Reconstruction, there were Black communities who, in fact, found a way to make themselves into what they wanted themselves to be. And this occurred in this context that we were talking about, the Indian Territory, right? And so in some way, we can say that, you know, Black, you know, the question of freedom and Black placemaking in Indian Territory accomplished, right, to some extent, what Reconstruction could not, right? And we know that this is why post-Reconstruction, Blacks started moving up to, you know, to Kansas and later to Indian Territory, right? So there was something accomplished in Indian Territory that felt like the kind of fulfillment of Reconstruction for that brief window, right? The kind of brief moment in the sun, as W.E.B. Du Bois calls it, right? You know, until Jim Crow comes in and everything just, you know, goes back to status quo, I guess. But, you know, the other thing that's interesting is that there is an actual idea of what repair looks like, right? So when we're thinking about reparations in a generalized African-American claim of reparations, meaning from slavery and then Jim Crow and so forth, what that is effectively an argument, one that I am in agreement with, right, for compensation for injury, right? But it doesn't actually do the job of repair, meaning taking that community back to a particular form, right? A form that is a repaired form. There's a different project there, right? However, in Tulsa, right, with the case of Greenwood and the reparations projects there is actually a notion of what they want their repair to look like. They want their repair, for better or for worse, right, to look like pre-1921 or the first half of 1921 Greenwood, right? They want that robustness of a community, of an economy, right? This is what they're asking for, basically. So a restoration, if you will, of Greenwood, right? And so that's why I think, you know, as Karla mentioned, you know, this return, right, to you know, that's what reparations, that's what Black futures, I think, at least in Greenwood, looks like. You know, the challenge, of course, is you know, how, you know, going back to the question of narrative, how does that idea get co-opted, and how does it get influenced by outside actors, outside entities, right, who aren't from the community? In other words, has a community of Greenwood been given the opportunity to actually sit and imagine, right, beyond just the very narrow narrative of what Greenwood in 1920 or early 1921 looked like? I don't know, but for those two reasons: one, shifting away from a centering of slavery, right, in the reparations claim, which is a geographic shifting, which is an ontological shifting, right, away from the plantation, away from the South, right. And also this question of it actually providing a kind of model for what a repaired Black community looks like. I mean, I think the history of African American political, action around these questions has looked like, repair has looked like a lot of different things, right? Repatriation, Ethiopianism, right? This notion of, well, to be a repaired Black people means we need to become Africans again, that kind of thing. And we have, contemporarily we have all kinds of language for those kinds of ideations, Hotep this and what have you, right? Sometimes disparaging. But Tulsa at least gives us an example of, and not one that I'm necessarily endorsing, but it at least gives us an example of a model whereby a Black community has a sense of what they want the reparations to accomplish in terms of the community formation that reparations could help, accomplish.
Wow, that's amazing. So I think I've learned, for one, that Tulsa and Oklahoma's Black towns might be unique for the ways they're built up, right, and intended to and imagine and hope for in the present, rather than the ways folks have tried to tear them down. I would love to open it up for audience questions right now.
If anybody has any questions?
So, the first time I heard about Greenwood was I had a course like in Schomburg Center in New York City, and I kind of took that story to heart, and it was like, okay, this is another affirmation that African Americans can create. I was like, I don't know, like 10. So it was like an affirmation that like African Americans can do something in the U.S. And you mentioned how that story of Greenwood, for the people of Tulsa, it's like it's not the same. It doesn't do the same thing that it does like for people outside of Greenwood. In terms of it, it's just like kind of a reminder that yeah, we were great, but now like we're here. We're not. We're in kind of. We've been kind of repressed once more. So I wanted to ask like what you think that story of Greenwood does for like African Americans outside of Tulsa, how it like affects them. Um, yeah, just how it helps them now that it's kind of been like disseminated in like the public, um, once more through like Watchmen and like just more conversations about it. Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think so. I was fortunate enough to go to Tulsa for the centenary this year, right? So I was there during the centenary events, and it was amazing because you kind of felt like what you were observing was what maybe Greenwood felt like, right? Lots of Black folk hanging around, eating food, buying stuff, enjoying themselves. And what was interesting is that I talked to a lot of those people, and a good portion of those folks were out-of-town people who had come to Greenwood, had come to Tulsa, right, to celebrate the centenary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And, what they shared was exactly that, right? That Greenwood, Black Wall Street represented this ability, this affirmation, as you put it, that Black folks could accomplish, really anything. And, and that's true, right? But there's just something to me, right, where when you exceptionalize that in a way, you almost make it impossible, right? You put it just outside of either temporally or in some other means. You place it just outside of your grasp, right? I think Kwame Ture put it best, right, in his Black Power address, right? Stokely Carmichael, you know, he said Civil Rights Act wasn't for black people, because black people always knew that they could go into a shop, that they were human, that they had rights, right? Civil Rights Act was for white people, so that the government could tell them, listen, FYI, black people can do these things because they're human beings, right? And so, you know, what we have is a history here in this country and across the West, where Africans were enslaved, of black people, you know, accomplishing their freedom, right? And it's important to note that, you know, and perhaps we need to just do more research, right, and just continue to dig up more of these stories. But it's about, you know, making that unexceptional. And I'll tell you a personal framing around it. I'm from Jamaica, right? I grew up in Jamaica, and black people were all over my money. Right? When I was in primary school in Jamaica and we had our workbooks, everybody from the judge to the thief in the book was black. Right? We have national heroes on our money, black. We have maroons on our money. Right? Now, what does that tell you? Right? And one, it's a symbol of pride in one's history. But what it is also the making of, you know, normalizing, right, black accomplishment. And I think there's a trap, right, when you create an exceptional story, right? Because it means it is not necessarily reproducible, right? And that can't be, right, you know, the kind of sensation that we feel when we see stories like Greenwood. Greenwood should be like, oh yeah, we had one of those in California, we had one of those in Texas, we had several of those in South and North Carolina, right? That has to be the story because that's actually the history, right? I mean, of all of the black towns that Karla has talked about in her work, right? What you see is, you know, Jim Crow, right, through statehood come in and effectively undo the progress that some of those black towns, many of those black towns are able to accomplish, right? We talk about Greenwood. We talk about the circulation of capital in Greenwood. One of the reasons why that was possible was, in fact, because of segregation. Because the money was technically not really permitted to leave, right? Because a black person couldn't go into a white department store and buy something. And so here are some of the complicated truths about the ways that some of these communities were formed. And so what is so important about, you know, Greenwood, about the black towns in Oklahoma, you know, goes back to my earlier statement of sovereignty. It was a place that black people made effectively, not entirely on their own terms, right? And it was reproduced, right? Dozens of black towns in Oklahoma, right? Indian Territory alone. And so I think that's what I want for us to take away from this, right? Because when we begin to exceptionalize and fetishize a single story, then what you end up having is an ability or inability to reproduce it, right? And that shouldn't be the lesson that we take away from a place like Tulsa, right? A better lesson is that it's actually quite common. Because if we did it then, in the context of post-slavery Jim Crow, then why can't we do it now, right? That to me, I think, is a lesson. Yeah.
It's complicated to me because to the extent that we don't have it normalized as it should be, you're absolutely right. That's what I think leads to the attraction to these stories. Right. We're attracted to them. We grasp them because it's like, yes, there's finally this story of black success. And so it's a real complication because you're right, we don't want to exceptionalize these things because we know from research that, in fact, these are not exceptions. At the same time, and I go back to sort of what we are publicly aware of, we are not publicly aware of the normalization and the non-exceptionalism of these stories, and that leads us to have this attraction to when we finally do hear the story publicly. So that's the real, I think that's the real complicated part. I mean, as you know, I'm very much interested in this attraction and this appeal of these kinds of stories and what is around this appeal of these stories. And I think that's part of it, the fact that we don't hear it enough, that we gravitate toward it because it's exceptional that we get to hear it. You know, it's not exceptional that it exists, that these stories are real, that these cases actually happen, but it is exceptional that we are told about them and we have access to them.
Hi, I guess mostly for Dr. Slocum. Can you give us some idea of like I'm feeling like there's a gap in my understanding of the Black towns and the rural towns.
Yeah.
You know, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, do they continue to exist throughout, or do they get dispossessed over time? That's what I don't understand. You know, where we are today.
Right.
Versus then.
So there were 62, well, the latest figure I've seen is 62. There are now 13 that are recognized as remaining in Oklahoma. So they don't all still exist. And there are various processes by which most of them no longer exist. Some of them have been folded into other neighboring municipalities, some of them just by sheer virtue of depopulation. Some of them exist, but they are just not incorporated. Many of them were never incorporated. So this number of 60 plus, they never formally exist because they were not incorporated, but they are recognized as actual places with place names that people recognize and consider to be their residence. So the official 13 that exist, it's kind of interesting because when the Oklahoma Historical Society counts how many Black towns there are, they now count unincorporated and incorporated. But what's very interesting is that when it comes to talking about how many remain, they're only counting the incorporated ones, and that's the 13. I actually do not know how many exist that are unincorporated. I don't feel like I have access to that information. I'm certain there are some. I know there are some actually because some of them I've written about, because some of the towns actually also have what I call satellite towns. So you might have, Boley is the most well-known and the largest of the rural Black towns in Oklahoma. But then Boley has other towns that are around it that are satellite communities of Boley that have a place name. They are unincorporated, but they are just spaces that have a named identity, and people in the community recognize. So that's really what happened. There are different sorts of accounts of when their numbers started to really drop off. So I think sort of the official Oklahoma Historical Society account is that they started to drop off sometime in the 1910s. That Oklahoma becoming a state now with Jim Crow laws meant that, you know, the freedom that people were seeking was not, and especially people that came there from the Deep South trying to, you know, get away from Jim Crow. They were finding that Jim Crow was now where they were before, so they were enticed to move on. Some people moved on. I mean, part of it was the Great Migration. People were just participating in the Great Migration. Part of it was a lot of these communities were also agricultural, and so the Depression and the boll weevil and agriculture, the Dust Bowl, these are also some things that created challenges just for their economic livelihood. And so we started to see the population numbers declining in the 1910s. People in the Black towns, however, cite integration as especially leading to their decline. So they feel like they still had a number of businesses through the 1960s. They still feel like they still had a sizable population, but they started to see that really dwindle once there was more, once they started losing their schools to school busing and desegregation of schools. And then also just people taking the opportunity to go to urban areas where there were more possibilities for that kind of social mobility.
Good evening. I'm curious about what type of collectivist strategies were used to acquire land in the first place there. And I say this as someone who's half Guyanese, and we acquired our villages post-enslavement through collective strategies. And I'm just curious if there was any research about that. And then the second part, which is just connected, so I guess it's not a second part, is if there's any research about the type of internal governance that communities had in these towns.
Mm-hmm. Can you restate your first part? You said about land.
How did people acquire land to begin with?
You mean historically or today?
In Tulsa, yeah.
Oh, in Tulsa.
I guess or Greenwood.
Right.
Yeah.
So Greenwood, Greenwood was created basically by these two black entrepreneurs who bought up, I can't remember how many acres, 40 plus acres, I can't remember exactly, but they went and bought up, a portion of creek land, right? So native land that was made available. And so Professor Slocum was talking earlier about allotment on the Dawes Act, where land was made available. What was interesting is that you had, and we didn't talk about the Creek freedmen, so what you had were, some of the, quote, 5 civilized tribes, right, that moved to Indian territory, held enslaved Africans, meaning they enslaved African American people. Some of them were free and lived amongst the community. But at the time of the Dawes Act, right, these black members, right, whether partially mixed race or however we're going to call it, right, were provided a certain portion of land as well. And so a lot of black migrants to Indian territory, who were called state Negroes, right, because they were coming from the United States, right, they weren't native blacks, as it were, they often sold land, to black migrants, right, who were coming from the South. And so Greenwood itself was founded by J.B. Stratford and O.W. Gurley, right, who were these two entrepreneurs who, bought land, and they both had these independent but yet, aligned visions of, providing and creating a black community. And so they bought land and then they created tracts of land, which they then sold on to black people who moved to, to Greenwood specifically. But in a way, it doesn't really differ from, I think the practice of the formation of all black towns, right, throughout Oklahoma, which were, oftentimes, bought by black arrivants, from, black, black creeks or creek freedmen, however you want to term them. Also, land was acquired. There was homesteading, right? So the land rush. Some blacks who participated in the land rush literally just showed up and claimed land, right? And that's another part of the story. So there were these two means. So yeah, I mean, you could talk about the governance of the black towns. I mean, I think
there are also in the black towns, though, in terms of land.
Yeah.
There were some white-owned speculating companies that would actually purchase the land from the Creek freedmen, who were enslaved people of the Creek tribes, and then sell it to black people. So they were doing this for profit. So it actually was a very dynamic space in terms of land acquisition and transfer and sort of transmission or just land acquisition and how that process happened. I mean, really, you have to think about there were Native Americans, whites, and Black Americans who were all sort of active together in this process, late 19th century, early 20th century of land acquisition. The governance structures of the black communities, do you mean historically again? Sorry about that. So they had their own town councils. Probably the most famous picture that exists for this big town, Boley, Oklahoma, is one of the town councilmen. If you were to Google that, that's the image you're going to see, and it's the town councilmen all standing on the steps. So they were known to have their own town councils and internal governance in that sense. There's also work about how many of their community members and potentially town council members, I'm getting a little bit outside of my area of expertise, I have to admit, I'm not a historian, but they were also getting involved in state politics as well. So some of them were taking up state positions and trying to, I mean, as Jovan mentioned, there was at one point an attempt to try to make Oklahoma a black state, and I think some people came ready, prepared to be politically active, and some of actually the recruiters that were trying to bring people to Oklahoma had a political and activist background. And so there were a lot of people that were very politically engaged who were both that way in the towns, but also at the state level as well.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our time here. Thank you so much for bringing this important conversation to Hanover. It's been amazing. So join me in thanking Dr. Slocum and Dr. Lewis.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.